This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 276 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So a lot happened between the last Mailbag show and this one. LeSean McCoy was cut, which opened things up a lot for Devin Singletary, and then Shady signed with the Chiefs, crushing the upside for Damian Williams and Darwin Thompson. Unsurprisingly, the most common questions that I got this week were about the Chiefs' backfield and how to value Williams, McCoy, and Thompson. So let's kick things off today with that. First off, I tweeted about this over the weekend when all of this stuff happened, but you can't sell this McCoy move as anything but a negative thing for both Damian Williams and Darwin Thompson. This is how fantasy football works, especially at the running back position. When you add a new player into the mix, it almost never is going to be a good thing for the existing players on that team. Because fantasy football is a volume-driven game. At the very least, even if you weren't projecting Damian Williams to see a huge workload, this now changes Damian Williams' ceiling as long as LeSean McCoy is healthy. This is not a good thing. Where it shifts things is kind of up in the air. We can pretend that we know exactly how that backfield is going to be split, but we'd just be making educated guesses. And I'd argue it's a situation with more guessing than a typical educated guessing scenario. Now, I'm not of the belief that LeSean McCoy is just totally washed. The situation in Buffalo wasn't great last year, so pointing to Shady's 3.2 yards per carry average doesn't really do it for me. Yards per carry will never do it for me. Not only that, but every single running back on Buffalo had a yards per carry rate last year that was pretty bad. Chris Ivory had a 3.35 rate on 115 carries, and he was second on the team in rush attempts. When you compare McCoy's yards per carry rate to his teammates' rate, it was about 0.6 yards worse than other Buffalo Bills running backs. So sure, he was less efficient per touch, but other 100-plus carry backs had a worse difference in yards per carry versus their teammates' yards per carry. That list includes Carlos Hyde, Dion Lewis, Jamal Williams, and Royce Freeman. Freaking Todd Gurley had a difference of 0.4, which was relatively close to LeSean McCoy. When you watch LeSean McCoy, he doesn't look like old LeSean McCoy. I totally get that. I agree with that. But he didn't have zero explosiveness last year. And in the end, it may not matter that much. The thing with running backs in fantasy football is that we know that volume drives their overall value. And volume is driven by coaches wanting to use those running backs. You have to hope that coaches are trying to put the most talented running backs on the field, which is why we should care about talent, but that doesn't always happen. And it's not as though LeSean McCoy is entering a backfield with Ezekiel Elliott. And as we know, McCoy has ties to Andy Reid. You guys might remember, but I actually half joked about this happening on a Mailbag show back in July when I was asked about which Buffalo Bills running back that I wanted on my team. I mentioned Devin Singletary, and then I said that Shady could get cut. And if he got cut, that he could be reunited with Andy Reid. Now, I'll get stuff wrong this year all the time. I already got stuff wrong. But that was at least a victory. But I mean, look, guys, I've talked about Damian Williams plenty on this show all summer. He was really good with the Chiefs last year. The upside was there if you were getting him in round 3. But the reason I couldn't take him over those top tier wideouts like a Mike Evans type is because the downside for Williams always existed. He doesn't have the best resume. He's a 27-year-old running back who's yet to truly break out across an entire season. That's why I thought that he was just fairly priced. Damian Williams backers can sit back and say, the haters of Damian Williams got lucky because LeSean McCoy got cut. Because someone like LeSean McCoy, someone with his profile, got cut. And that's not totally wrong. If you were anti-Damian Williams all offseason, this was a pretty lucky thing to happen. But at the same time, this wouldn't happen if Damian Williams was really, really good. If the talent was undeniable. Now, I still have Damian Williams ranked ahead of LeSean McCoy, and I think that he still sees more volume in the backfield this year. And if your league is deep enough, I would still stash Darwin Thompson. Not only could talent just emerge, but LeSean McCoy's missed games in 3 of his last 4 seasons, and he's 31 years old. And then Damian Williams, as we know, has never been an every down back. We don't know what his body can handle. So sure, Thompson's just sort of a handcuff, but it's a questionable enough situation where if you can hold on to him, just try to do it. But I've got Damian Williams as a lower end RB2, Shady as a higher end RB3, and Thompson as a stash as we enter the season. Williams is still the player that I would want in that backfield. But this McCoy signing really did hurt him, and I don't know how you can sell it otherwise. Now, just as a reminder, as I mentioned yesterday, the exclusive NumberFire NFL free play for all you listeners is back for the 2019 season. Each week you'll have a chance to win Number Fire premium subscriptions by playing FanDuel, and it won't cost you a dime. This week, your link to enter the contest is fanduel.com/league/numberfire. That's fanduel.com/league/numberfire. This Sunday, fill out your lineup and see if you can land a free subscription to Number Fire Premium. This first question is from @DonKamuna. Which tight end is likely to break out a la Kittle this year? Someone I can stash on my bench while I stream tight end in week 1. Something I've said a lot on podcasts this summer was how the tight end market seemed to correct itself this season. Instead of the obvious breakout tight ends with crazy athleticism being drafted late, fantasy managers started to take them in the middle rounds. And I'm referring to that O.J. Howard, Evan Ingram, and Hunter Henry tier. So I don't know if we'll see that type of breakout this season from someone who was drafted really late. O.J. Howard is my favorite from that middle tier, but he doesn't fit the same fantasy draft profile that George Kittle did. But if there's one guy, I think Darren Waller's really interesting. He's got the athletic profile, he's got the pass catching ability, and he could walk into some volume in that Raiders offense. So he's my dart throw pick for this question, but I don't think that we're going to see anything like Kittle last year. Partially because George Kittle last year is nearly impossible to repeat. This next question is from @Eric Belair. With Zeke back, can we still hold on to Tony Pollard as a bench injury stash? I would at least hold on to him during the first week or two to see what his role looks like. I'm not much of a handcuff person, but we can't ignore that Zeke hasn't been in camp, and there's always the chance that he's just not in the type of game shape that he should be in, even though reports are saying that he's fine. And Pollard could realistically carve out some role in that offense, given his abilities as a receiver. I doubt it'll be league-winning or game-changing without a Zeke injury, but he's still worth a bench stash. This next question is from @BFDanielM. This sounds like a start-sit question, but it's not really meant to be. Should you start Kyler Murray week 1? More of a how high are you on the Cardinals offense without really knowing what they're up to this year type of question. So first off, I'm only taking questions from Twitter for the Mailbag show each week during the season. That's just the only way that I can handle my inbox. But also, when I sent the tweet for this week's questions, I specifically said non-start-sit questions. And half the responses were still start-sit questions. Now, I'm not complaining here. I appreciate the interaction. I just think that it's hilarious. I'll be on FanDuel's Facebook page every Sunday doing a Facebook Live at noon Eastern to help you answer those questions. So I'm not ignoring them, but the Mailbag show wouldn't be very intriguing if it was just me answering start-sits. Anyway, to your question. There's a lot of variance with that Lions-Cardinals game this weekend. I do expect the Cardinals to run at a fast pace. We're going to see a completely different offense compared to the one that we saw in the preseason. But my worry is the Lions' defensive line against the Cardinals' offensive line. The Lions could do some serious work getting to Kyler Murray. So I think it just depends on your risk tolerance with anyone from Arizona. I'd still start Kyler Murray over a streamer like Stafford, but it's a high-risk move. This next question is from @MixSalmonBeer. JJ, where do you sit on the Mixon-Bernard situation following Bernard's extension? I've seen many fantasy analysts now out on Mixon. Curious as to how you see it. Awesome content, by the way. Thanks. The biggest concern I have with Mixon is what his market share numbers are going to look like with this completely new regime in offense. Because what's not being talked about Joe Mixon is that last year he also had a bad situation. AJ Green missed a lot of last year. The Bengals' offensive line wasn't good, and Andy Dalton missed 5 games too. Gio Bernard missing time last year also helped Joe Mixon a bit. But even with this horrendous situation, Mixon still rushed for almost 1,200 yards while catching over 40 passes. And that was in 14 games played. So I'm not totally down on Mixon like a lot of the industry is. I'm sort of buying where I can get him at a discount. But I'm cognizant that his situation isn't great, and what could really derail his season is a new scheme and his usage in that scheme. But I'm more optimistic than most probably about that scheme. This next question is from @Brandon_Warren. Who is your completely out of nowhere Philip Lindsay player this year? Man, the thing that's tough about this question is that it's hard to imagine a scenario where someone just takes over their backfield without an injury like Philip Lindsay did last year. That's partially why he was such an outlier. But look across the NFL at some of the questionable starters at running back. Tampa Bay is probably the top target from that standpoint, which is partially why people, including myself, are adding Dare Ogunbowale right now. I think a deep sleeper and maybe a potential out-of-nowhere candidate is Raheem Mostert. That's just based off of a depth chart that has players who haven't been workhorses in the NFL, and Mostert wasn't bad when he was healthy last year. I've actually added him in some dynasty leagues this week with the 49ers keeping just 3 running backs. So those are 2 dart throws. Brian Hills may be another one, I guess, because if something happens to Devontae Freeman, he could see more work. But I highly doubt that we get an out-of-nowhere Phillip Lindsay type season this year because that doesn't happen very often at all. This next question is from @fantasy_ideas. Who is the best player to have on your bench in a 12-team PPR league? Hines, Justice Hill, or Jalen Samuels? So I like Justice Hill of those 3 the most. Samuels looks like he might just be a handcuff, so he has the most upside of the group, but he needs an injury. And I just don't really get the Nyheim Hines love that I see out there. I like him as a player, and the Colts might see more negative game scripts this year. But there's also a chance that Marlon Mack sees more passing down work, and Hines just lacks upside even if there was an injury to Marlon Mack. So I'd go Justice Hill because he could just naturally have a role right away, and he's good. This next question says, FOB strategy going into the season. How to figure out how much to bid on waiver claims week in and week out. Any insight is helpful. So I wanted to answer this question on the show today because I'd planned on doing a separate late round podcast episode on this topic over the offseason. But when I dug into the data, I couldn't find anything. I couldn't find trends on when to spend your FOB and how to spend it because it seems to be completely player by player specific. So I have zero insight, and I wanted to share with you guys that I have zero insight because I did at least try to have some insight. This next question is from Jeff339595522. How can you capitalize on the inevitable outlier performances that will play out in week 1? Yeah, I think the answer to this question is in the question itself, which is that you recognize that it's an outlier. You sell high when your league mates may not understand how or why it was an outlier performance. That's what the 15 transactions show is for each week, so hopefully that'll help every Tuesday. This next question is from @AlexBH111. JJ, what is your take on depth charts order? Do you take it into account? Example, Breida listed ahead of Coleman in the 49ers depth chart. Huge thanks from Brazil. So here's the thing with the 49ers depth chart that got released this week. You can see on the image itself that lists the starters, there's a note at the top that says, compiled by the 49ers football communications staff. This isn't coming from the coaches. You guys know that I love Matt Breida this year. He was featured in my Players to Target article and podcast in early August. But Coleman has gotten more run with the first team, and he should still be projected to see more touches in that offense this year. So I guess to answer your question directly, I pay little attention to what a depth chart says. This last question is from @xline_NA. What is your strategy for investing in murky backfields? We know there is value to be had when there are uncertainties in who will get touches, driving down ADP. What are the primary heuristics that you prioritize and value in these situations? This just goes back to some of the criteria that I talked about on episode 135 last year, which is on spotting a breakout running back. People often get turned off by crowded backfields, but crowded backfields usually come with lower costs. It's like the 49ers backfield. People are like, oh man, that backfield's going to be a mess. But guys, no one is drafting Tevin Coleman in round 3. The reason the costs are down is because of the crowded backfield. But the criteria for spotting these breakouts is that they usually come from crowded backfields, they're usually pass catchers, they usually are in good offenses, and they're not usually handcuffs. So you can use that criteria throughout the season to pick up on situations where a running back could emerge. But that's going to do it for today's show. Thanks to all of you guys for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And if you're on Apple Podcasts, do me a favor and leave a rating and review. And you can also follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Catch me on FanDuel's Facebook Live at noon on Sunday. But if you can't, good luck in week 1.